Good evening, and welcome to Sleepy Historian, the only place where military glory wears wool socks and smells faintly of pickled turnips. Tonight, we knock an arrow, slowly, gingerly, perhaps a bit apologetically, and aim it straight into the underappreciated, lightly lice-ridden world of the medieval archer. This was the man who stood at the edge of the battlefield, not important enough for a horse, not quite anonymous enough to escape blame, shivering under a damp hood, chewing something root-adjacent, and preparing to be both heroic and completely ignored by history textbooks. So before your eyelids get as heavy as a longbow draw, click that subscribe button, gently, like you're pulling a bowstring made of overcooked noodles. And if you're awake enough to remember, leave a comment with your time and location. Nothing fancy, just 1:12 a.m. under a weighted blanket, Bristol. We like to know which time zones were helping fall asleep slowly, with purpose, and historically accurate complaining. There are few ways to wake up gracefully in the 14th century, especially when you're a yeoman archer and your mattress consists of damp hay, burlap, and your own regrets about joining the local levy. The sun hasn't risen yet, but your spine already knows it's morning because it has spent the last 6 hours negotiating with the pokier bits of straw and the wooden floor underneath. You are not in a castle. You're not even in a cottage, technically. You are in something between a barn and a shed. A hastily assembled encampment with a slightly rotting timber frame and the soothing scent of yesterday's sweat, mildew, and communal breath. You roll over and immediately regret it. The arch of your back whispers, "Ah yes, the longbow lifestyle," and your left shoulder audibly clicks in agreement. Outside, the dew has settled over the ground like a polite but icy warning. Your boots, which you cleverly left outside to air out, are now semi-frozen leather tubes. Their shape resembles that of a small, unhappy badger. You slide your feet in anyway, because the alternative is frostbite, or worse, being yelled at by someone with a feather in their helmet. There's no rooster here, no ringing bell, just the soft, rhythmic sound of someone coughing nearby in a way that suggests both tuberculosis and unresolved emotional issues. A fellow archer, no doubt. Maybe someone named Wulfric, or Edgar, or more commonly, "Oi, you there." You stretch, slowly, carefully. Drawing a longbow for 8 hours a day doesn't exactly build flexibility. It more or less replaces your tendons with twine. Your arms ache. Your forearms throb. You could snap firewood over your biceps, but you cannot touch your toes, and frankly, you don't see the point anymore. Breakfast is not ready. Breakfast has never been ready. In this part of the world, breakfast is a concept rather than a meal. You will likely gnaw on a piece of dark bread that you carried in your pouch since last week, now harder than your boots and carrying a hint of pocket lint. There's a jug of something nearby, vaguely described as small ale, which tastes like watered-down regret and has the viscosity of damp cloth. You drink it anyway. It's barely fermented, barely cold, and barely not full of bugs. But it's wet, and it's yours, and it'll have to do. The others stir around you, men who have lived the same day for the past 3 months. Their faces are weather-beaten, like ancient tree bark left out in the rain. No one talks yet. Conversation doesn't happen before sunrise. Only grunts, sniffles, and the occasional creak of leather armor being buckled with exhausted fingers. Someone sneezes explosively into a rag that might once have been white, and everyone pretends not to notice. Your quiver waits near the door, filled with arrows that you fletched yourself, hunched over a stump, muttering curses at feathers that refuse to cooperate. Some are straight, some are not. Some have names carved into them, superstition mostly. You glance down at one labelled, "Not today, Satan," and nod approvingly. Beside the quiver lies your longbow, your most expensive possession, and the most wooden expression of your life choices. It took months to craft. You've oiled it with everything from bear fat to candle wax to goose grease. You once cried when it cracked slightly near the knock. It didn't help. You've since mended it with twine and hope. Stepping outside is a full-body experience. The cold slaps you across the face like a well-aimed trout. The grass crunches underfoot. The sky still painted in hues of iron and ash. A crow, somewhere, lets out a call so bleak it feels personal. The air is sharp and tastes faintly of firewood and distant dung. There's a field ahead, not a battlefield, yet, just an open, soggy expanse of possibility. Officers move about like slightly cleaner peasants, issuing commands in voices that sound both too awake and too enthusiastic. You quietly resent them. Then again, they probably resent you back. Today, there may be practice, or marching, or waiting, possibly all three. You'll string your bow with chilled fingers, knock arrow after arrow into the air, and pretend it's all for something more than surviving long enough to brag in a tavern later. But for now, your stomach growls. You scratch your chin, pull your hood up, and accept your role as an expendable speck in the great saga of English archery. Because while kings and lords plan strategies and battles are remembered in books, someone still has to wake up at dawn in a tangle of hay and obligation and get ready to miss breakfast. There's no such thing as a relaxing day off when you're an English archer. The concept of rest has not been invented, and even if it had, it wouldn't apply to someone whose daily training involves drawing a 100-pound longbow repeatedly until their arms vibrate with the memory of pain. It begins early, not just in the day, but in life. You're expected to start pulling a bow before your voice cracks. In some towns, it's mandatory. By royal decree, no male over the age of 7 may pass a Sunday without practicing with the bow and arrow. This is not a joke. This is your youth. Church in the morning, archery in the afternoon, existential dread somewhere in between. Fast forward to now, adulthood or something like it, and you are no longer a gangly boy aiming at hay bales. You are a state asset, a lanky, calloused muscle machine with the wrists of a stone mason and the posture of a question mark. You have become part of the machine that wins wars by volume, by sending more arrows through the sky than most people send thoughts through their heads. Today's training begins in a field that can generously be described as unremarkable. The ground is uneven, the wind is uncooperative, and the smell is mixed. There are targets lined up at various distances, bundles of straw shaped into circles, propped against old barrels, trees, and, when resources are tight, the vague hope of accuracy itself. First comes warm-up, but not the kind with stretches and breathing exercises. No, you warm up by drawing your bow. Not once, not twice, but over and over again until the sinews in your arms hum like overworked lute strings. Your instructor, a man whose eyebrows appear permanently furrowed, watches with arms crossed, and a face that suggests you are personally responsible for his indigestion. You shoot standing, then kneeling, then crouched behind a barrel, then while moving, then while not moving, but being yelled at to move. The arrows whistle, thud, and occasionally ricochet in ways that feel legally questionable. A nearby trainee nearly loses an ear. No one seems surprised. The pace increases. You're no longer aiming. You are delivering arrows the way rain delivers itself, fast, ceaseless, and with little concern for precision. You're expected to shoot 10, maybe 12 arrows in a minute. That's 1 every 5 seconds, more or less, while under pressure, with wet bowstrings, sweating hands, and the knowledge that if you fail, you may be asked to demonstrate again. And again. And again. Each arrow is a minor miracle of medieval engineering. A slender wooden shaft, goose feather fletchings, and a steel or bodkin tip depending on what you're aiming for. Armor, or something with a pulse. You know how to make them. You've sharpened them in campfires, repaired them with horse glue and fragments of better days. Each one carries not just a point, but a tiny whisper of you. Your aim, your strength, your fatigue, your growing desire to be literally anywhere else. The repetition settles into your body. Your fingers grow numb. The inside of your elbow twitches. Your shoulder begins to ache in that deeply familiar way, as if reminding you that your body is not a temple, but a well-worn outpost, a friend to pain, a companion to calluses. Nearby, someone faints, possibly from heat, possibly from hunger, possibly from the realization that this is, in fact, their life now. No one stops the training. A man steps over him carefully, knocks his next arrow, and keeps going. Eventually, a break is declared, not by a bell or a horn, but by the simple act of someone collapsing onto a bundle of rags and declaring, in a tone both firm and apathetic, "That's enough for today." You sit. You breathe. Your bow lies across your lap like a well-fed serpent. You drink something lukewarm from a flask and wipe the sweat from your face with the sleeve of a tunic that smells like every decision you've ever made. You say nothing. No one says anything. The silence stretches out, broken only by the rhythmic creak of someone else continuing to shoot because they like the feeling. That person is both impressive and deeply suspect. You consider your hands. They look older than you feel, knotted, blistered, half permanently curled around the memory of a bowstring. You stretch them and hear a sound not unlike stepping on fresh snow. Soon it will be time to do it all again. War does not train itself. And the longbow, for all its elegance, is a demanding taskmaster. Still, there is something meditative about the rhythm, about drawing and loosing, again and again, until thought vanishes and you become part of the mechanism. Not a man, but an instrument, a living extension of wood, sinew, and purpose. And as the sun dips low and the wind changes direction, you rise, soar, sorely underpaid and spectacularly unrecognized, ready to return to the thing you do best, hitting a target from a distance without ever really hitting the mark in life. By now, your arms feel like they've been chiseled from tension and regret. You've flung more arrows than most people have thoughts before breakfast. And what reward awaits such monumental exertion? A meal. Or more precisely, the promise of a meal. The medieval archer's diet, carefully curated over centuries to ensure maximum blandness, awaits. The midday rations are stored in a wooden chest with an iron latch, locked not for security, but to prevent rats from staging a successful coup. Inside, the building blocks of culinary austerity. There is bread, of course, not the sort with air pockets and sourdough tang. This bread has the texture of masonry and the density of a solid plan gone wrong. It's been baked until the crust can double as a defensive tool, and if you dropped it from waist height, it would leave a dent in the ground, or the cook if he wandered too close. You break it slowly, carefully, as though it might retaliate. It doesn't crumble so much as cleave, and each bite is a negotiation between hunger and dental endurance. Still, it fills the stomach eventually, in the same way sand fills a boot, reluctantly but thoroughly. Next comes the leek, singular. It is boiled, probably yesterday, and it retains the exact flavor profile of water that once knew a vegetable. It droops on the plate, if one can call a square of wood a plate, with a sense of resignation, as though it had dreams once. Perhaps it aspired to be in a stew. Perhaps it imagined being paired with herbs. Instead, it lies here, limp and pale, like a dish rag soaked in broth and left in the sun. For protein, there is sometimes cheese, not the soft kind that melts or inspires poetry. This is a cheese that must be shaved with a knife, like bark from a reluctant tree. It smells faintly of something that might have once been a sheep, or possibly a strong opinion. It is not bad, exactly, just assertive. It demands attention from your palate, then refuses to leave. On special days, paydays, feast days, or days when someone accidentally caught something, there may be meat, a shred of salted pork perhaps, or a sliver of preserved fish. These are not meals, but memories of meals, enough to remind you that real food exists, just not here, not today, and not for you. To drink. Ale, thin, brownish, and never cold. Water is generally frowned upon, unless you're fond of intestinal rebellions. The ale isn't particularly strong, but it's consistent, warm, yeasty, slightly bitter, like the mood of most archers after a long march. It hydrates. It soothes. It blurs the edges of your memories just enough that you might, for a moment, forget the condition of your feet. There are no utensils. You eat with your hands, sometimes with a dagger if you're feeling fancy. There is no napkin, only the back of your sleeve, already decorated with the smudges of ash, dirt, and effort. Table manners are optional, assuming there is a table. Usually it's just a log, a rock, or your own lap. Around you, men eat in silence, not from discipline or etiquette, but from fatigue. The act of chewing takes effort. Speaking requires intention, and nobody has energy for both. Somewhere nearby, someone tells a joke involving a goat, a bishop, and a sack of barley. No one laughs, but the telling of the joke is enough. It counts as morale. You finish the bread, barely noticing the pebble that chipped your tooth. The leek has wilted further in the bowl, defying the laws of physics. You sip the ale slowly, as if savouring its ability to be not water. There's a bit of cheese left, but you hide it in your tunic for later. This is known as provisioning, though it's more accurately not wanting to face disappointment twice in one afternoon. By now the sun is overhead, and shadows shrink like debts being ignored. There's a breeze, and with it the faint suggestion of movement, training, resuming, or perhaps marching orders. You sigh. The bow awaits. It always does. But before you go, you allow yourself a moment. You sit back against a tree, the bark pressing through your tunic like nature's way of saying, "Don't get comfortable." You stretch your fingers, which crack audibly, and glance around at your fellow archers, each as tired, hungry, and partially crumb-covered as you are. This is the meal. Not just the food, but the sitting, the pause, the reminder that you are, briefly, something other than a mechanism of war. You are a person who has eaten something slightly edible, and in this life, that counts as luxury. Soon, the call will come to resume training, or marching, or to stand in formation while someone with a flag yells abstract concepts at you. But for now, you have leeks in your stomach, crumbs in your lap, and the vague hope that supper might involve something that didn't come from a barrel, and if not, well, there's always the cheese you hid in your sleeve. By now, your fingers have adjusted to a permanent semi-curl, your arms have become symmetrical planks of tension, and your back hums quietly from the morning's exertions. It's time to return to the real reason you exist in this field. Tall, heavy, slightly warped, and made from the heartwood of a yew tree. The longbow, a weapon of great range and even greater expectations. Nearly as tall as the man who carried it, and only marginally less demanding. The longbow is not a tool so much as a wooden lifestyle. It does not rest. It does not lean passively against walls. It looms. Each one is unique, hand-shaped, slow-cured, and moody in wet weather. Yew, the preferred wood, was favoured not because it wanted to be, but because it happened to grow in places where no one had invented alternatives. It has a dark core and a lighter outer layer, combining elasticity with a subtle threat of splintering. Handling a longbow is less like wielding a weapon and more like managing a temperamental colleague who could put a hole through a door. Drawing it takes practice, years of it. From childhood, boys were trained to pull increasing weights until their backs warped slightly and their shoulders began to resemble the contours of small boulders. It's said that a practiced archer could release up to 12 arrows a minute. This is technically true, but rarely tested, as the only time anyone wants to do such a thing is during an actual battle or a bet that gets out of hand. The bowstring, made of hemp or flax, is oiled, waxed, and treated with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious relics. Break it, and you've reduced a masterpiece of physics to a stick with abandonment issues. It is never left strung when not in use, because that would be too convenient, and also because the wood would eventually sag, much like your morale after 5 hours of drill. Nocking an arrow is simple, in theory. In practice, it's a dance of muscle memory, calloused fingertips, and quiet cursing. The arrow must rest just so. The fletching, goose feathers if you're lucky, or seagull if you're unlucky, must be angled correctly. The shaft must be smooth and straight, although in many cases it's as straight as the man who fletched it after his 4th ale. Drawing the bow is an act of devotion. You do not simply pull, you invite. You lure the string back with a movement so practiced it lives in your bones. The tension builds across your chest and down your spine. The bow groans faintly, like a tree reconsidering its life choices. You aim not with your eye, but with every inch of your being, trained to know where an arrow will land simply by the feeling of it. And then you release. There is no dramatic twang, just the briefest sigh of air and the whirring whisper of feathers. If you're lucky, and by now, luck is half your job, the arrow strikes true, or at least impressively. It might bury itself in a post, a target, or a hay bale meant to represent a Frenchman. You count it as a success. Everyone does. There is no value in discouraging accuracy with too much scrutiny. Of course, not every release is a triumph. Sometimes the string snaps your forearm, and you're left with a welt that resembles an angry red worm. Sometimes the arrow spirals off like a moth chasing a lantern. Sometimes you forget to let go of the string at all, and you are rewarded with an embarrassing twang and the disapproval of your captain. But these are the rituals of practice, repeated until your muscles understand better than your brain. Maintenance is everything. Each night, the longbow is unstrung, dried, oiled, and whispered to like a cranky pet. The string is coiled carefully. The wood is inspected for splinters, cracks, or signs that it may soon give up entirely. Your bow is your livelihood, your defense, and your only real friend in the heat of battle. Lose it, and you become an infantryman, a fate worse than any. In battle, the longbow is the voice of chaos. Arrows descend in volleys, darkening the sky like a very specific kind of weather forecast, sharp and uninviting. Archers don't aim for individuals, they aim for groups, for the vague outlines of enemy formations, and for the general morale of anyone on the receiving end. But today is not a battle, it is training, and training is eternal. You stand in formation, shoulder to shoulder with others who have made the same strange decision to dedicate their lives to tension and twine. You knock your arrow, draw, hold for a heartbeat, and let fly. You do this again, and again, and again, until your fingers lose feeling and your arms become theories of motion more than flesh. You keep shooting until the instructor blows his horn, waves his flag, or simply slumps on a log and declares it lunchtime. By then, the sky has shifted, the targets are riddled, and the field is littered with spent arrows and ambitions. You collect what's retrievable. You make mental notes to fletch more. You inspect your bow one last time and sling it across your back, where it rides like a burden you chose. The longbow does not praise you. It does not thank you. It waits. It always waits. Quiet, tall, and slightly judgmental. By this point in the day, your shoulders ache in a way that suggests you've borrowed time from a future of joint pain. Your bowstring fingers are lightly numb, and your stomach is starting to whisper gentle protests. But before we even think about what passes for lunch, we must discuss the joyless wardrobe that holds your entire aching frame together. Your uniform. Now, uniform may be a generous term. There's no crisp tailoring, no resplendent metal accents, no parade ground symmetry. You are not a knight. You are not a noble. You are instead draped in layers of deeply practical, profoundly uninspired cloth, garments designed by committee, stitched by obligation, and dyed in shades of mud adjacent. The first layer is always linen. It clings to your skin in a way that is either clingy or scratchy, depending on how recently it was washed, which is to say, rarely. This shirt, sometimes called a tunic, sometimes called a chemise, sometimes just referred to with a sigh, is the closest thing you have to comfort. It absorbs everything: sweat, rain, ambition. You wear it until it becomes a second skin, or, more accurately, a first warning sign for those downwind. Over the linen, a jerkin. This is a vest made of leather, wool, or something vaguely armor-like if you're lucky. Its purpose is threefold: keep you warm, vaguely protected, and barely stylish. It accomplishes all three goals at about 40% efficiency. It buttons or laces up the front, often unevenly, and has a knack for sagging just enough to make you look perpetually apologetic. Trousers are similarly uninspired. Thick woolen tubes that begin at your waist and end in a mysterious taper near your calves. They are secured with a drawstring, which you must retie every few hours unless you enjoy the looming fear of public embarrassment mid-volley. These trousers do not stretch. They do not breathe. They simply contain. On your feet, hose and boots. Hose are what happens when someone tries to make socks but gives up halfway through and insists they're finished. They cover your legs with a kind of woolen optimism, often sagging at the knees and pooling at the ankles like moody curtains. The boots, oh the boots, are either stiff, soaked, or suspiciously warm from stepping in something you hoped was only mud. They lace up the side or buckle with leather straps that snap when you least expect it. Their soles are thin enough to remind you of every stone you step on, and thick enough to dull your sense of hope. If it's cold, you might be granted a cloak. It is not dramatic. It does not billow. It is more of a damp rectangle with ambitions. It ties at the neck, usually with a cord that chafes, and serves primarily to catch rain before it can soak into your other clothing. A hood is optional. So is dryness. No armor. Archers are not armored in the way knights or men-at-arms are. At most, you might wear a leather bracer on your drawing arm to keep the bowstring from chewing up your forearm. It's the medieval equivalent of a wristband, except instead of absorbing sweat, it absorbs punishment. Helmets? Sometimes, if available, and only if your commander decides you're worth the metal investment. More often, you'll just have a coif, a little linen cap that serves mainly to make you look bald before your time. The whole ensemble is scratchy, heavy, and layered in the emotional weight of 1,000 similar outfits worn by men who spent their lives being cold and slightly damp. The colours are earthy, not by design, but by default. Dirt tones, wool greys, washed-out greens, and the faint rust of old stains from unmentionable origins. Patterns are rare. Personality is limited to how creatively you tuck in your belt or whether your hose match. They usually don't. Yet there's something oddly comforting in this collection of ill-fitted rags. The uniform is a signal. You are part of something. A rank, a line, a field of similarly dressed figures, all aiming toward the same general target and occasionally remembering to fire at the same time. It binds you to your fellows, if not with pride, then at least with shared discomfort. The weight of your quiver against your hip, the creak of your bow slung over your shoulder, the quiet scratch of wool on linen as you shift from foot to foot, waiting for the next volley. These are the sensations of a life lived outdoors, in formation, under orders. And when the battle begins and the arrows fly, no one will care what you're wearing. Not the enemy, not your commander, and certainly not history. But until then, you are dressed, if not for success, then at least for survival. After a morning spent hunched in a crouch, loosing arrows into a sky that refuses to care, your body begins to whisper one desperate question. Is it time for food? You wouldn't call it hunger exactly. It's more of a hollow awareness, a quiet absence behind your ribs, a kind of medieval echo that says, something used to be here, possibly stew. Lunch for a yeoman archer is not a celebration. It's more like a scheduled disappointment. The official term was rations, but that word is almost too formal, too optimistic. In reality, lunch arrived via two possibilities: a communal mess of ingredients boiled until legally edible, or the contents of a linen satchel that had been packed days ago and now resembled archaeology more than cuisine. Start with the bread. Always the bread. Hard, round, and insultingly beige, this was not the soft, crusty loaf of modern daydreams. It was a dense, floury puck that could withstand weather, warfare, and brief moments of existential despair. You didn't slice it, you chipped at it. With a knife, with your teeth, or with the side of your helmet if it came to that. There was no crust, it was all crust. The middle, if you reached it, was only slightly less aggressive than the exterior, and had the flavour profile of slightly damp timber. Butter, if you had it, was considered high luxury, and like all good things in medieval life, probably stolen from someone with a title. More likely, your bread was accompanied by a smear of goose fat, or a lonely garlic clove kept in your coin pouch for flavour. The fat added shine, the garlic added consequences. Together, they formed what passed for seasoning, and made your breath into a tactical weapon. If you were fortunate, perhaps someone in your unit had bartered well or looted politely. You might also have a slice of cured meat. This was not the dainty charcuterie of a tavern feast, but rather a slab of something vaguely pig-adjacent, riddled with salt and dreams of tenderness. It was chewy, fibrous, and aged in a way that made your molars question their own structural integrity. Still, it was protein, and it distracted you from your bread-based grievances. Cheese was another variable, usually hard, always waxy, and possessed of a smell that announced itself before it was unwrapped. It was a badge of maturity. If your cheese could survive 2 days in a satchel, so could you. The mold was not a problem. It was a seasoning, a conversation piece, a biohazardous friend. Occasionally, someone would have dried fruit, usually dates or figs, stuffed into a cloth pouch and forgotten until they fused together like geological sediment. Sweet, sticky, and vaguely medicinal, these little nuggets were the medieval equivalent of a morale boost. They didn't really energize you, but they made you feel briefly less like a living cautionary tale. And water, let us not forget the water. Carried in leather flasks or wooden canteens, it was tepid by dawn, warm by midday, and somehow always slightly smoky. Possibly from the campfire, possibly from the leather, possibly just the taste of time passing. You sipped it slowly, conserving each gulp like a miser guards coins, because refills required a trip to the nearest stream, which meant mud, slipping, and the vague possibility of dysentery, or worse, conversation. No one talked much during lunch, not because of strict discipline, but because chewing was a full-time occupation. Words had to wait their turn behind bites that lasted several minutes. There were sighs, maybe a grunt of approval if someone pulled out a preserved plum or a strip of surprisingly tender venison. But mostly, there was just the gentle, ambient sound of exhausted men gnawing their way through a ration that felt like a dare. Occasionally, you'd glance over at the knights, sitting in their own cluster, surrounded by servants with polished platters and bottles of something that probably wasn't water. Roast fowl, spiced wine, fresh bread, smiles, laughter. They were having a different war entirely, one where lunch was something to be enjoyed rather than endured. You, however, had hardened biscuit crumbs caught in your hose. Still, there was a strange comfort to it all. The same meal, the same faces, the same muttered complaints. A routine that grounded you when everything else, the weather, the enemy, the morale of your captain, felt fluid and slightly doomed. This lunch, such as it was, marked a midpoint. It reminded you that the morning was over and the afternoon still waited to be survived. And so you finished chewing, wiped your fingers on your jerkin, and glanced toward your bow. The string still taut, the arrows still sharp, the wind still unbothered by your plans, and the field still very much in need of watching. If you thought being a medieval archer was simply a matter of pointing the bow and letting fly, then, well, congratulations. You'd have lasted 4.5 minutes. The reality, as with most things historical and disappointing, was far more difficult, repetitive, and gently ruinous to the body. Longbow practice wasn't a hobby, it was mandatory, regulated, and expected with the kind of unspoken sternness usually reserved for church attendance and paying taxes in chickens. As a yeoman, you were legally required to practice archery on Sundays and holidays, and while this might sound like a quaint way to keep skills sharp, it was in fact a way for the crown to ensure you were ready to kill a Frenchman at short notice. Happy Easter. Now, the longbow itself was less a tool and more a 6-foot rebellion against your spine. Made of yew or ash and often as tall as its user, the longbow could deliver an arrow with astonishing speed and power. It could punch through armor. It could end a cavalry charge. It could also, over time, quietly dismantle your shoulder and give you a posture reminiscent of a wilted sunflower. Drawing it required force, between 80 and 120 pounds of pull, and that force had to come from your back, your arms, your legs, your soul. Practicing this draw again and again wasn't just tiring, it was transformative. The skeletons of longbowmen, when unearthed centuries later, show signs of asymmetric development. Enlarged bones on the draw side, twisted shoulders, rib cages that leaned as if permanently bracing for bad news. So, you begin, standing in a muddy, wind-bitten field. They're all muddy and all wind-bitten, facing a crude target made of straw and ambition. Your fingers are raw from the bowstring, thick linen that cuts without ceremony and leaves the kind of calluses you could sand furniture with. There are gloves, yes, but they're rough, fingerless things that protect exactly the parts of your hand you never actually use. You lift the bow, nock an arrow, pine shaft, goose feather fletching, a tip forged by someone with more soot than ethics, and draw. The tension creeps into your forearm. Your elbow buzzes, your shoulder argues, and then release. The arrow snaps forward, flutters ever so slightly in the wind, and lands with a dull thunk somewhere near the target. Not on it, but near, close enough to avoid shame, far enough to feel humble. You repeat this process dozens of times. The sun drifts lazily above, indifferent to your aching joints. Your tunic sticks to your back. Someone nearby mutters a prayer to Saint Sebastian, patron of archers and unfortunate pincushions. A goose honks somewhere in the hedgerow. and you feel for just a moment a peculiar camaraderie with it, both of you awkward, feather-strewn, and far from home. Sometimes your captain walks the line, inspecting form. He rarely speaks, but when he does, it's often to point out that your elbow is too high, or your stance is uneven, or your arrows are consistently 3 inches wide of decent. Encouragement was not a medieval specialty, but the real judge is your own arm. Around the 15th draw, it begins to throb in a very specific way, a dull, insistent complaint that starts at the shoulder and ends somewhere behind the eye. Around the 30th draw, your wrist goes numb. This is expected. Around the 50th, you stop aiming entirely and begin to shoot more out of instinct, fatigue, and quiet resentment. This is also expected. And still, you continue, because there are wars coming. There are fields in France waiting to be covered in smoke and arrows. There are nobles who will want their honour defended from horseback, and they will expect you to win the day from the mud below, drawing and loosing until your fingers blur. Practice is not about hitting the target. It's about becoming a part of the machine. It's about transforming your body into a weapon of routine. It's about making pain into a background noise so constant you eventually forget it has a name. By the time practice ends, your arms tremble with each movement. You drop your bow with a groan, flex your fingers as if rediscovering them, and glance around at your fellow archers, all equally broken, equally tired, equally silent. And then someone mentions supper, not with enthusiasm, not even with hunger, just with the quiet reverence of men who know that what comes next will be boiled, beige, and slightly chewy. If one were to compile a list of culinary highlights from the life of a medieval archer, the list would be brief, perhaps too brief, possibly a single sentence ending with, "And that's why they boiled it." Because after a long day of pulling 100-pound draw weights and developing shoulder arthritis in real time, you might imagine that dinner was a reward. Something hearty, delicious, maybe celebratory, a thick roast, a spit-turned bird, something with a crust, and you would be wrong, so very quietly, beigely wrong. Dinner, for the average English archer, was more of a surrender than a meal. A ladle of something hot enough to qualify as food by medieval standards, served into a wooden bowl that had known more winters than you had teeth. The stew, always stew, was a matter of what could be found, what hadn't gone off, and what the cook was too tired to throw away. Root vegetables were common, though the term vegetable was often aspirational. A turnip, certainly, but not the kind of turnip a modern gardener might cultivate with pride. This was a turnip that had fought back, possibly cursed at someone. It floated in the pot like a suspicious guest, its shape unclear, its origins murky, its flavour aggressive. Meat might appear, but don't let that raise your hopes too far. It might be a lump of pork, tough as jerkin leather, or a sliver of mutton, or something that once lived near a river and didn't die of natural causes. The important thing was that it was there, that it had been stewed long enough to forget its own name. And that, with enough ale, you could convince your stomach not to ask questions. The ale, by contrast, was the evening's saving grace. Not because it was strong, it rarely was, but because it was safer than water, and because it took the edge off the relentless ache in your shoulders, the sting of your blisters, and the memory of the arrow you shot directly into the captain's boot. It dulled the day into a soft haze, where conversation was slow, and laughter came in quiet, wheezing bursts. Seated around the fire pit, if you were lucky, and the rain had stayed elsewhere, you and your fellow archers would form a quiet ring of human exhaustion. Some would eat quickly, out of hunger or habit. Others would sip at their broth, letting the steam warm their faces and their sinuses, a medieval substitute for any known cold remedy. The fire crackled. A dog might wander through, optimistically sniffing for bones and scraps, completely unfazed by human warfare or digestive complaints. Somewhere, someone might pull out a pipe, or a battered lute missing 2 strings and optimism. Music would happen, not music as art, but music as comfort. A tune remembered from home, a rhythm half-muttered, half-hummed, and entirely off-key. But it didn't matter. The only critic in attendance was the moon, and she was famously indulgent. Evenings, you see, were not for conversation so much as for recovery, for loosening the sinews, for letting the eyes drift toward the firelight, unfocused, for thinking of home, or trying not to. Dinner would end when the pot was empty, or when the floating turnip had been politely ignored into oblivion. Bowls would be scraped clean with crusts of bread so old and dry they were nearly architectural. Some men slept where they sat, others shuffled to cots or furs, or simply a patch of dirt that looked less hostile than the rest. Dreams came fast and dense, filled with arrows, with fields, with vague, turnip-shaped monsters. And in this quiet end to the day, this stew-fed, ale-softened silence, you could almost forget that war was coming, that arrows would fly, that your name might be recorded only on a broken tag in some forgotten armory. But for now, you sleep, full enough, tired enough, human enough. As the stars shuffled quietly overhead and the embers of stew-thickened fires sighed their last smoky breaths, a particular kind of evening ritual would unfold, not glamorous, not dramatic, but necessary, tedious, and strangely meditative. The longbow, that towering curve of yew and spite, didn't maintain itself, and if it ever seemed like it might, it was probably plotting against you. A longbow was less a tool and more a roommate with needs, quirks, and the occasional emotional demand. And chief among those demands was attention to its string. Now, the bowstring was not merely string, not a shoelace, not some idle cord found in a merchant's bag. No, this was a strip of woven horsehair, or sometimes linen, soaked and stretched and bound like a nervous system for your weapon. It connected your intent to your target, and if it snapped, mid-draw, mid-battle, mid-anything, it became the most expensive way to punch yourself in the face. So, every archer worth his salt, or at least worth the crust of salt clinging to his jerkin, had to care for the string like it was a beloved but high-strung relative. And care, in the 14th century, involved an assortment of methods passed down from archer to archer with the reverence of sacred texts, except nobody could read, and most advice began with, "All right, so don't tell the sergeant, but..." First, the bowstring had to be inspected. Carefully. This meant crouching under low torchlight, or the milky glimmer of the moon, tilting the weapon this way and that like a particularly suspicious baker inspecting a loaf. Every twist, every fray, every uneven tension had to be coaxed into obedience. Any stray fibre could mean disaster, or, at the very least, ridicule. Then came the waxing, a small lump of beeswax, often kept in a pouch near the archer's heart, as if it were some ancient totem, would be rubbed lovingly along the string, upper, down, again, until the cord gleamed like a tired cat and smelled faintly of apiculture. The wax helped repel moisture, reduce fray, and give the string just a bit more resilience. It also made the archer's fingers smell pleasantly confusing, which was as good as cologne got in camp. But perhaps the most questionable part of the process was the grooming. Yes, grooming, as in combing, with fingers, with a sliver of wood, and sometimes, if one were particularly fastidious and regrettably traditional, with teeth. Why teeth? Because nothing says battlefield readiness like chewing on horsehair in the dark, while muttering about frictions and fibres. To the modern observer, this might appear barbaric. To the medieval archer, it was just Tuesday. And heaven help you if the string needed replacing. That required a backup, one you'd braided yourself weeks ago when your fingers weren't raw from shooting or swollen from cold. You'd kept it tucked somewhere dry, or at least dryish. Probably not next to the stew pot, certainly not near the dog, definitely not under the man who snored and smelled of mead. It was a careful balance. If all went well, the string would be sound by morning. The bow, waxed and taut, would lean nearby like a coiled animal, patient but expectant. You, on the other hand, would have wax under your fingernails, a curious tang in your mouth, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing you'd prevented catastrophe with nothing but a wax lump and determination. This was the secret side of archery, not the heroic charge or the volley of arrows darkening the sky, not the glory or the tales sung by bards who'd never held a bow. No, This was the invisible labour, the bedtime routine of a professional, the kind of maintenance that felt like grooming a dragon's eyelashes, tedious, precise, and slightly absurd. And as the night deepened and distant owls questioned the moon with melancholy hoots, archers drifted to sleep knowing their weapons were ready, tended, trusted, whisper-quiet companions in a world where silence and skill often meant survival. There is a particular stillness in the morning air before arrows fly, not a tense one, not exactly, more of a gentle, resigned hush, the kind that hangs over a village pond just before someone falls in, or over a practice field before someone misses wildly and pretends they meant to. Target practice was, in theory, a simple affair. Find a hay bale, stick something in it to represent your mortal enemy, step back an appropriate distance, narrow your eyes like a man trying to read a church pamphlet written in Latin, then breathe, draw, aim, release, repeat, forever. But of course, it was never quite that straightforward. You see, for the medieval archer, accuracy wasn't just about hitting the target. It was about doing it with a weapon taller than yourself, strung tighter than your knees on a cold morning, and under the suspicious gaze of a man who looked like he hadn't slept since last harvest. Hitting the target wasn't the hard part. Believing that it mattered was. This was where the existentialism crept in, quietly, like a philosophical badger under a tent flap. Imagine you standing in a misty field that smells faintly of onions and horse, your breath fogging in the dawn air. Ahead, a hay bale squats like a judgmental toad. It's been there for weeks. Someone's drawn a crude face on it with charcoal. It might be a caricature of the local bishop, or a pig, or your sergeant. Hard to say. You nock an arrow, draw the bowstring until it hums like an annoyed insect, and fire. The arrow hits just off-center. You frown. Knock again. Fire. Slightly better. Fire. Worse. Fire. Perfect. Fire. Miss entirely. And then it happens. Your brain, tired from chewing bread crusts and being yelled at in Middle English, suddenly asks, why? Why am I doing this? Why does this hay bale hate me? What if I am the hay bale? What if war never comes, and I've spent a decade learning to skew a straw? This is not an unusual train of thought. Most archers at some point have stood in front of their target and contemplated the bigger questions. Does hitting the center mean I'm a good archer, or does it mean I've simply memorized a meaningless action? Is this what success feels like? Cold hands, sore shoulders, and an endless supply of misshapen arrows that bend the wrong way. These musings were usually interrupted by a shout from across the field, hit the damn thing or go peel onions. Motivation enough for now. So, you aim again. The string hums, the arrow arcs, it hits. You grunt with satisfaction that feels slightly hollow. But you also feel something else. Quiet persistence. Maybe it's not about the bale. Maybe it's about the doing, the rhythm, the effort, the small moment of control in a world where plague exists, kings change weekly, and bread is suspiciously expensive. You retrieve your arrows, some straight, some bent, one stuck in a tree behind you, and begin again. Because that's what archers did, over and over, until their fingers blistered, and their backs curved, and their quivers sat a little lighter. They practiced not for glory, but for readiness. For the moment when it wouldn't be a bale of hay, but a charging knight, or a closing gate, or something worse. And, as the fog lifted and the camp slowly roused with the familiar sounds of pots, curses, and someone discovering they'd slept in something wet, you'd return to your fire with the satisfying ache of muscles well used. You'd feel strangely cleansed, if not in body, then in mind. You'd remember, faintly, that the work mattered. Somehow. Still, tomorrow, the hay bale will be there, waiting, smirking, daring you to question your place in the universe again. If there was one thing guaranteed to temper the reckless bravery of a medieval archer, it was breakfast. Or rather, the thing that pretended to be breakfast. It came in a bowl, always wooden, sometimes cracked, frequently scorched from having been too near a fire or too near a boot, and in it was something. To call it porridge would be generous. Porridge, ideally, is warm, thick, and sustaining. This was more of a lukewarm truce between oat and water, interrupted occasionally by floating particulates of unknown origin. Some of these particulates were former weevils, others were still weevils, but by the 18th spoonful, even they blurred into background texture. Protein, they said, as if that made it noble. Sitting by the smouldering embers of last night's fire, hunched over like a man waiting for a prophecy, the archer would regard his bowl the way a knight regards a dragon from far away, curious, concerned, and quietly accepting that this may not end well, and yet he would eat, because there was no alternative. The medieval food pyramid was more of a plank, flat, splintery, and dangerously leaning. You had grains when they hadn't gone sour, root vegetables when they weren't busy fermenting in storage, and onions, always onions. Medieval society was built on the back of the onion. It flavored everything, sometimes intentionally. You might be offered a side of bread if the camp baker was both sober and successful. Though success was relative, his loaves tended to be denser than trebuchet stones and only slightly more digestible. Butter was a dream, cheese a fantasy, eggs, not unless you had personally bribed a hen. Still, an archer could count his blessings. He had a spoon, which was more than the pikeman could say, and while his porridge might slosh like a stagnant moat, it was warm. Usually. Sometimes. There was a certain camaraderie in the morning meal. Archers, eating in silence, chewing thoughtfully while staring into the middle distance like philosophers who'd misplaced their parchment. Occasionally someone would mutter a theory about whether the strange taste in today's porridge meant mould, mustard, or malice. But mostly, they ate and stared and waited for warmth to reach their toes. Breakfast was never rushed, not because it was sacred, but because it was the only moment in the day not filled with shouting. No instructors barking, no horses screaming, no weapons clanging, just chewing, and a soft symphony of sniffles and belches. Once the bowls were scraped mostly clean, though never entirely, the grain-to-stickiness ratio made that physically impossible. There came the wiping ritual. A sleeve, a patch of grass, a trouser leg that already carried the stains of at least 3 meals, a patch of pitch, and possibly someone else's blood. It didn't matter. Clean was aspirational. The medieval longbow was not a polite weapon. It did not whisper. It did not ask. It did not wait for you to feel ready. It was a towering length of you that demanded your spine, your sinews, and occasionally your sanity. To the untrained eye, it was a stick. To the trained archer, it was a full-time job disguised as a piece of wood. Every morning, after porridge and weevil-related negotiations, the archer would approach his bow like a man greeting an unpredictable old friend, one who once gave you a concussion but also saved your life in France. 6 feet long and deceptively plain, the longbow was a marvel of tension and intent. Unlike crossbows, which relied on gears and triggers and smug mercenaries, the longbow asked only for one thing: you. Every shot was a promise you made with your entire body, and if you failed to keep that promise, the bow would let you know, with a satisfying twang, followed by a not-so-satisfying collapse of your shoulder joint. Drawing it was an art, not a gentle one, like painting, more like the art of lifting heavy furniture while pretending you're fine. The draw weight of a proper war bow ranged from challenging to career-ending. It required years of conditioning and the sort of back muscles typically seen in draft animals. This was why English archers, when excavated centuries later, often had skeletal deformities. Their spines didn't so much curve as recalibrate. Their arms told the story of 1,000 pulls, 1,000 battles, and exactly 0 yoga sessions. To practice was to suffer, not dramatically, quietly, patiently. Every morning involved pulling the bowstring again and again, just to remind your body that pain was temporary and war was permanent. Blisters became calluses. Calluses became hardened badges of competence. And still the bow took more. It stretched you, bent you, shaped you. Maintaining the bow was also an act of devotion. It was made of yew, ideally, or elm if you were unlucky or cheap. Yew was chosen for its inner and outer qualities. One side resisted compression, the other tension. The result was a natural sandwich of power and fragility. To leave your bow strung overnight was an offense. The tension could warp the wood. The gods would weep. Your instructor would yell. So every evening you unstrung it with reverence, laid it flat, and prayed it wouldn't develop a personality overnight. Arrows were another matter. Mass-produced by the thousand, they were long, heavy, and unapologetically lethal. Each was fletched with goose feathers, left wing only, so they'd spin correctly, and tipped with a variety of arrowheads designed to ruin someone's Tuesday. The bodkin for armor, the broadhead for unarmored misery, the barbed head if you were feeling particularly medieval. Carrying all of this was no small task. The bow itself didn't sling well. It was too tall to casually lean on and too dignified to use as a walking stick, though many tried. Arrows went in a quiver, slung across the back in theory, though more often they were jammed into the ground, ready to be drawn like bitter carrots from the earth. And yet, despite all this effort, there was a strange affection that grew between archer and bow. It was a companion, a tool, a status symbol. If you wielded a longbow, you weren't just a soldier. You were the future of medieval warfare. You were what kings banked on. You could kill a knight at 300 yards. From behind a hedge, in the rain, while chewing that same dreadful porridge. But still, there was no glamour in it. Archery was not about shining steel or heroic charges. It was about standing in mud, in rows, waiting for the signal, and then unleashing thunder with your fingers. Again, and again, and again, until your arms ached and the arrows were gone, and the enemy was a little more confused than they were before. It's a truth universally acknowledged, at least in medieval England, that if you were a yeoman archer about to march off to war, you were going to be both underpaid and overdressed. Not overdressed in the sense of luxury, no. There would be no silks, no brocade, no delicate imported velvets whispering around your ankles. You were overdressed in the more literal sense. Too many layers, none of them breathable, all of them wool. Start with the tunic. It was, in theory, a simple garment, a kind of longish shirt with vague aspirations. Your average archer's tunic hung to mid-thigh, cinched at the waist with a belt that had seen better centuries. It was dyed, ideally, in a shade approved by your local livery, perhaps a muddy green, or a washed-out crimson that had once been vibrant before spending a winter soaking in fire smoke, rainwater, and disappointment. Underneath, you wore a linen shirt, though calling it linen is generous. Depending on the quartermaster's budget, your shirt might have been stitched from fabric so coarse it felt like wearing a bag of turnips. And speaking of discomfort, let's not forget the hose. Ah yes, the hose. 2 long woolen leg tubes tied to your doublet or held up with a complex network of laces and hope. There was no elastic, no waistband, just the sheer force of personal conviction and friction keeping your trousers up. In theory, they kept your legs warm. In practice, they offered insulation and the sensation of being slowly hugged by an irritable sheep. And then, of course, came the shoes. You might imagine a sturdy boot. You would be wrong. Medieval archers wore shoes more akin to slippers with ambitions. They were made of thin leather, often turned inside out and stitched directly to the sole, which meant you could feel every rock, root, and regret beneath your feet. Waterproofing? Optional. Lifespan? Maybe a few weeks, unless, of course, it rained, which it did. Often. Then you were basically walking in cold soup. The outfit wasn't complete without a cloak, or cape of mild regret, as some might call it. It was heavy, usually fastened with a brooch, and had a tendency to soak up water with alarming enthusiasm. When dry, it smelled faintly of lanolin and smoke. When wet, it smelled of everything that had ever gone wrong in a barn. But here's where it got personal. You were issued a livery badge, emblazoned with the crest of whatever noble or monarch you were currently disappointing. You'd sew it on, proudly or reluctantly, depending on how patriotic you felt that morning. These badges served as battlefield identification, a sort of medieval team jersey. Except instead of colours and mascots, you got rampant lions and ominous birds, and the quiet understanding that if you died, at least someone might identify your body and return your bow. Beneath the garments, Hygiene remained a theoretical construct. Baths were rare, fleas were not, and the communal sleeping arrangements did little to encourage freshness. It was entirely possible to march for days reeking of garlic, ale, and historical inevitability. The occasional dip in a stream might help, but more often it just rearranged the dirt. And yet every archer dressed with a kind of earnestness. They might not have had polish or flair, but they had purpose. Each piece of clothing was functional, meant to keep you just warm enough, just mobile enough, and just dry enough to endure the march, draw the bow, and hopefully live to itch another day. But even before they marched, before they were dressed and drilled, they had to know one crucial truth. You can't be an archer without being able to hit something. Every medieval archer's journey, noble or not, eventually led them to a clearing in the woods, or a muddy field behind the smithy, or a churned-up stretch of turf optimistically called the practice yard. This was not a glamorous place. There were no flags, no cheering spectators, no grand tournaments with gleaming knights and embroidered favours fluttering in the breeze. Just hay, mud, occasionally a chicken. The training target, if it could be called that, was usually a lopsided bundle of straw lashed into something vaguely human-shaped. If your idea of human-shaped included a wonky neck and no discernible limbs, it was stuck on a pole, or in the ground, or sometimes tied to a tree when the quartermaster couldn't be bothered. This was your enemy now, and your job? Hit it, repeatedly, from 30 paces, then 50, then 100, rain or shine, or more often than not, sideways drizzle. Your bow was a longbow, 6 feet of seasoned yew, ideally, though some were made of elm or ash, depending on the tree population and the local plague situation. It wasn't fancy, but it was powerful. Drawing it required strength, patience, and shoulders forged by years of hauling buckets, bales, and probably uncooperative pigs. The string bit into your fingers, your elbow trembled, and then you released, thwack, and the arrow flew, ideally in the direction of the hay, but just as often into the hedge, a nearby barn wall, or a fellow trainee's hat. Arrows weren't free. Each miss was a problem. Fetching them involved trudging through fields, poking the grass with a stick, and enduring your instructor's withering stare. Arrows were fletched with goose feathers, their shafts painstakingly straightened, and their heads often hand-forged. You were expected to treat them with care, though care often meant shoving them into a leather quiver that smelled faintly of feet and cabbage. Training was relentless. You'd shoot until your arms ached, then shoot more. You were taught to aim by instinct, by repetition, by the slow muscle memory of 1,000 notches and releases. There were no sights, no rests, just you, your eyes, and a silent prayer that the wind wouldn't shift right as you loosed your shot. And of course there was the shouting. Somewhere nearby was a sergeant, or a master bowman, or an uncle with unresolved emotional issues, yelling things like, "Lower your elbow," or "That's not even the right direction," or "Do you think you'll scare the French by hitting their sheep?" Encouragement was rare. Sarcasm was plentiful. Applause? Non-existent. You trained in all seasons. In spring you sneezed through fields of blooming hay. In summer you sweated into your woolen tunic and tried not to pass out. In autumn you dodged falling apples and early frostbite. And in winter you discovered that drawing a bow with fingers frozen into small wooden sausages was a particular kind of medieval cruelty. Despite the hardship, or perhaps because of it, you grew stronger. You learned to nock an arrow by feel. You learned the arc and drop of your shaft. You began to judge distances the way some people judge tea temperature, with supernatural accuracy. You stopped flinching when the bowstring snapped close to your ear. You started hitting the hayman more often than not, sometimes even centre mass. And once, you knocked off its lumpy burlap head, and no one could tell you that wasn't progress. You weren't just training for sport, you were training for war. Real battlefields had moving targets, screaming men, and consequences. But first, you had to earn your place. You had to show that you could hold the line, aim true, and reload with fingers raw and lungs full of smoke. Eventually, you'd get your badge, you'd join a company, you'd be handed a cloak and a stipend and a place in the ranks. But before that, you had to survive the marching. They never told you how far it would be. Or if they did, it was in vague medieval terms. A day's march, or over yonder, or past the third ruined chapel and left at the tree that looks like a duck. In practice, marching to war felt less like a brave expedition and more like being part of a very badly organised parade with no music, no snacks, and a deeply unreliable sense of direction. You rose before dawn. Always. The morning mist hung low like a misplaced blanket and clung to everything with cold, damp fingers. Your tunic, your cloak, your eyebrows. All wet. Your socks, if you were lucky enough to own two that matched, were sodden before your second step. And your boots, those hard leather contraptions hammered together by someone who clearly hated feet, rubbed your heels raw by breakfast. Not that breakfast helped, a crust of yesterday's bread. If you were travelling in company, maybe a hunk of cheese that smelled suspiciously like the inside of your helmet. Water from a communal skin passed around with the generosity and hygiene of medieval times. You chewed in silence. You walked in silence. And when someone did speak, it was usually to curse at a mule, complain about the mud, or suggest that maybe war was overrated. The road was not always a road. Sometimes it was a track. Sometimes it was a rut. Sometimes it was a river pretending to be a path. Your feet would slip, your cart would groan, and your bow would bounce against your back with every jolt. Arrows clinked in their quiver like discontented spoons. And always, always, there were cows. Nothing in the medieval world moved with more misplaced confidence than livestock on a military route. Entire columns would grind to a halt while a single indifferent ox stood in the middle of the path, chewing its cud with the measured apathy of someone who knew you wouldn't do anything about it. You might be sworn to the king, clad in your archer's gear, your war face honed to a scowl, but you still had to wait for Daisy to finish crossing. The boredom settled in around mid-morning. The landscape stopped being interesting. Trees blurred together into a single long hedge of leafy sameness. Fields stretched into more fields. Occasionally you passed a village, or what used to be one, depending on the local bandit situation. Sometimes there were signs of recent battle, a burned barn, a half-buried helmet, or a horse that wasn't sleeping so much as being dramatically still. No one sang marching songs, not like in the stories. Real soldiers muttered, limped, adjusted their straps, and wondered when the next rest stop might appear, knowing full well there were no inns, no bathhouses, and definitely no medieval coffee carts. The commanding officers rode ahead, their horses looking smug and well-fed. They didn't walk, of course not. Walking was for the rest of you, the archers, the pikemen, the poor saps dragging carts of arrows and bundles of tents that never unfolded correctly. When the sun reached its highest point, you stopped, not because it was time to eat, but because someone's wheel broke, or a horse threw a shoe, or the bridge up ahead wasn't so much a bridge as it was 3 logs and a prayer. So you sat, in a ditch, on a rock, with your feet aching and your knees wondering if they'd ever forgive you. You plucked bits of gravel from your boot, adjusted your laces, and stared at the horizon like it might offer a shortcut. Occasionally someone would try to nap, only to be woken by a goat or a sergeant yelling something about keeping formation. The march resumed, and with every step you wondered how close you were to battle, to the moment you'd stand in a line, knock your arrows, and fire into a sky full of smoke and shouting. But until then, you trudged, you endured. You thought about your haybed at home, about clean socks, about whether being a cobbler might have been a wiser choice. And finally, eventually, you saw the flags. A camp, tents, fires, the smell of something vaguely edible and possibly legal. You made it. You'd arrived. Tomorrow, you'd face the enemy. But tonight you'd collapse in a heap of gear and hopes, surrounded by snoring comrades and a suspicious number of insects. And while you closed your eyes, knees stiff, shoulders sore, you might find a small comfort in knowing you'd marched the miles, earned your place, and survived yet another bovine traffic jam. Of course, the real fun begins when you actually pick up the bow in battle. The theory behind a longbow volley is quite noble, majestic even. Archers, rows upon rows of them, lined up with military precision, each man a cog in a deadly wooden machine. They raise their bows, they draw, they release. and 1,000 arrows hiss through the air in unison, a cloud of feathered inevitability descending upon the enemy like doom on a budget. In theory, in practice, it's more of a controlled chaos, less majestic symphony of precision, and more panicked choir of men hoping they don't drop their string. The order comes suddenly, always too soon, always barked by a man on a horse who isn't within range of the return fire. Bows are raised. Some men knock arrows with the smooth confidence of practice. Others fumble, fingers stiff from cold or nerves or that one splinter they didn't deal with during the march. One man sneezes. Another drops his arrow and curses as he bends down to retrieve it, knocking into the archer beside him. The front rank kneels. The back rank stands. Or that's the plan. Sometimes people forget. Sometimes someone stands when they should kneel and ends up with an arrow through a hat. One poor soul will always let fly early and mutter a quiet oops as the rest of the line glares. The sound of a volley isn't the sharp twang you might expect. It's a collective groan of wood under tension, the soft whistle of fletching slicing through air, and somewhere the distant thud of arrows meeting wood, armor, or sometimes something much more squishy. And then silence. Not total silence. The kind of heavy pause that sits on the shoulders of the line, waiting. A breath before retaliation. A held exhale, shared across dozens of archers, all standing in that strange limbo between shooting and being shot at. Then, like clockwork, comes the return fire. If the enemy also brought archers, and they usually did, the air fills with rebuttal. Not polite rebuttal, not diplomatic notes, but sharp, pointy, gravity-assisted rebuttal. You hunch lower. Your shield, if you have one, suddenly feels far too small. If you're lucky, you remember to duck behind it. If you're unlucky, you remember after an arrow shatters a tree limb beside your head. Your commanding officer bellows something heroic, likely recycled from the last battle. Morale is mentioned. So is bravery. There's often a reminder that they're just men, like us. But the real motivator is the arrow that lands inches from your boot, reminding you that they're also shooting men, like you. And yet, in the midst of the madness, something clicks. You knock another arrow, draw, anchor, aim, roughly, because precision is for archery contests, not this open field hurricane of iron and intention. Loose, the arrow flies. You don't see where it lands, but you hope it did something meaningful, or at the very least, inconvenient. Your arm starts to ache. Your fingers, calloused as they are, feel the bite of the string. You shift your stance. Draw again. Shoot again. The rhythm takes over. You become a cog in that grand, violent machine. And the line holds. You glance to your left. Tomlin's still there, chewing his lip like it's a tactical decision. To your right, Bertram swears every time he shoots, as if each arrow offends him personally. One man is bleeding from the ear and hasn't noticed. Another is trying to knock 2 arrows at once. Creative, if inefficient. Time stretches or collapses. You're never sure which. Eventually, the horn sounds. Or a flag rises. Or someone very official-looking waves a very official stick. The line stops. Orders are barked again, and the line stumbles backward. Not retreating. Repositioning. Very heroically, with strategic dignity. You breathe. That was one volley. There will be more. Possibly many more. But for a brief moment, you are simply a man with a bow, standing in a muddy field, unsure whether you hit a knight, a tree, or the unfortunate goat someone brought as a mascot. And yet, you were part of the storm. Of course, archery wasn't just about shooting arrows into the unknown. No, sometimes you were also tasked with carrying messages, scouting terrain, or, if things were truly desperate, being handed a sword and told to go help the infantry. For all their usefulness, raining down feathered pessimism from a respectable distance, archers were often treated as the Swiss Army knives of medieval warfare, only with fewer tools, less prestige, and significantly more lower back pain. In the mind of a commander, an archer was not just a ranged unit. Oh no, an archer could scout, carry, dig, relay messages, and occasionally hold a pike if the situation got really out of hand. This expansive interpretation of archer responsibilities often came at the precise moment when they'd just run out of arrows, dignity, or both. Take scouting, for example. Archers were light on armor, fast on foot, and, crucially, expendable, which made them ideal candidates for slipping into enemy territory at dawn to have a look around. The only guidance? See what they're up to, don't get caught. Helpful. You'd trudge through brambles, waist-deep in suspicion, and early morning damp, all for the privilege of peeking at a group of tents surrounded by people who definitely didn't want to be peeked at. If you made it back alive, you were handed a lukewarm flask of barley water and immediately sent to deliver a message, because archers, with their sturdy calves and mild desperation, also made excellent couriers. Now, medieval communication was interpretive. No radios, no written orders, unless someone had time and a monk. Just breathless young men sprinting across churned-up fields, yelling things like, "They're coming," or "Form the wedge," only to arrive too late or to the wrong group entirely. If you were lucky, the receiving side even spoke the same dialect. When messengering and scouting were momentarily off the table, there was always digging. Latrines, trenches, graves, optimistically for the enemy. Archers, being neither noble nor heavily armoured, were prime candidates for chivalry. Some campaigns spent more time with spades than bows. Worse still were the times you were told to stand guard, not glamorous palace guarding, no embroidered tabards or ceremonial spears. More like, go stand by that wagon wheel in the rain and alert someone if something catches fire, which, eventually, it would. And then, when all sense of military hierarchy finally unravelled, you might be asked to pick up a polearm and hold the line with the infantry. A terrifying phrase, hold the line. For someone whose job usually involved not being in stabbing range, suddenly being instructed to act like a human wall was profoundly unsettling. There was no training, just a vague sense that you were supposed to stand near the other panicked people and look angry. Longbow in one hand, pike you didn't ask for in the other, helmet slipping slightly over one eye. You were transformed from a long-distance pessimist to a short-distance optimist with very few survival expectations. And let's not forget the endless logistical tasks, setting up tents you wouldn't sleep in, moving barrels of arrows you wouldn't shoot, and helping someone's nephew mount a horse because his father's a lord, you know. Yet somehow, through it all, archers endured. Not because they were especially hardy, though many were. Not because they were well fed, though rarely. But because archers were, by nature, adaptable, slightly cynical, moderately clever, and always ready with a sarcastic comment when asked to carry yet another bundle of kindling. And so they marched, side by side with the pikemen, the cooks, the banner boys, and the very lost nobles. All part of the grand muddy ballet of medieval conflict. There is a special flavour of frustration reserved for those who are perpetually bossed around by people wearing better shoes. And in the medieval army, that tension reached operatic levels when it came to the relationship between archers and knights. On one side, the archers, calloused, slightly underfed, and usually damp. On the other, knights, polished, perfumed, and positively convinced that the war could not be won without their horse looking extra majestic. Knights were trained from birth to believe they were living metaphors for glory. They were spoon-fed tales of chivalry, honour, and how battles were best won by dramatically charging in a straight line while someone played a lute. Meanwhile, archers were trained, usually by necessity, to hit things from very far away and then hide behind a tree. This difference in battlefield philosophy created tension. Archers were often positioned on the flanks or tucked behind hedgerows, doing the extremely unromantic but crucial work of softening the enemy before the heavily armoured nobility arrived to claim the spotlight and, often, the credit. If things went well, the knight would raise his sword triumphantly. If they didn't, he would find the nearest archer and demand to know why nobody was shooting anything. But perhaps the real strain in this working relationship came down to expectations. Knights expected loyalty, archers expected to be ignored. Both were correct. A typical day for an archer might begin with a noble galloping by and announcing, "Hold this ridge," without explaining which ridge or how many enemies were approaching, or whether reinforcements were expected. The archer, nodding solemnly, would then turn to his fellows and whisper something helpful like, "So, we're dying here, right?" To a knight, an archer was a tool, like a sword, but cheaper and slightly more sarcastic. Orders were rarely kind, and even less frequently made sense. Cover the left flank might come just as the left flank had vanished. Hold your fire would be yelled after all the arrows were already mid-air. Occasionally, knights would attempt to inspire the archers with pep talks, which usually consisted of shouting for glory while adjusting their spurs. These speeches were not particularly well received. Glory, after all, was rarely awarded to the man whose job required standing ankle-deep in bracken and hoping the wind didn't shift during the volley. Even outside battle, the two groups lived in separate universes. Knights had squires and wine. Archers had burlap and warm beer. One wrote poetry, the other carved dice. They both perhaps wrote home, but only the archer apologized for the smell of the parchment. Still, there were rare moments, fleeting as they were, when a knight and an archer understood each other. Usually this was when both were equally lost, equally muddy and equally disappointed in the day's leadership. Or when the knight's horse threw him into a stream, and the archer helped him up with a quiet snort and absolutely no questions. Such moments didn't erase the layers of class and command, but they did stitch a tiny, muddy thread between two very different kinds of soldiers. There are few objects in history that carried as much weight as the English longbow, figuratively in terms of its battlefield significance, and literally because it was an enormous piece of yew that required the upper body strength of a determined ox and the patience of someone who really didn't like iron weapons. The longbow was not a weapon for the idle or the impatient. You couldn't simply pick one up at the local blacksmith shop between a tankard of ale and a bad decision. No, this was something that had to be coaxed into existence with time, effort, and an unwavering tolerance for splinters. The process began, as most things in medieval England did, by finding a tree, but not just any tree, it had to be yew. Specifically, the part of the yew that grew slowly on the north-facing slope of a hill that hadn't been cursed by a hermit. Preferably, the kind of yew that had survived frost, wind, and the occasional goat with no appetite for bark. Once the tree was chosen, and possibly apologized to, it had to be felled, which involved a saw, 2 men, and a deep belief that none of this would go wrong. Then the wood was cut into long staves, and then you waited for 2 years, minimum, because yew needs seasoning, which is a medieval term for leave it in a shed and forget about it until the rats move out. As the moisture gently drifted from the wood, the archer-to-be would visit occasionally, nod at it respectfully, and check for warping, rot, or signs that someone had tried to use it as firewood. When the wood was ready, meaning it had stopped making strange noises when touched, it could be carved into shape. The outside layer, or sapwood, became the back of the bow, the inside heartwood, the belly. The natural tension between the two gave the bow its terrifying power. This duality had to be preserved, which required careful shaving, scraping, and muttering. No machines, no shortcuts, just a knife, a good eye, and an enormous amount of beeswax. Ah yes, beeswax. The duct tape of the Middle Ages, used for waterproofing, smoothing, and also because it smelled better than the archer did. Mixed with tallow and rubbed lovingly along the bow's body, it helped prevent splitting and cracking, especially when the weather turned damp, an eventuality so frequent that damp was just considered a personality trait in medieval England. Then came the string. This was not string in the modern sense. No cheerful spool from the haberdasher's shop. This was a twisted, woven length of gut or hemp or sinew, preferably not your own, and it had to be strong enough to survive repeated stress, but also flexible enough not to whip back into your face like the universe rejecting your ambitions. Each bowstring had to be made by hand, ideally by someone with the patience of a monk and the fingers of a spider. Waxed, stretched, and then strung with care, it would hum with barely suppressed energy, like a lazy cat pretending it wasn't going to scratch you. The final touch. A knock carved into each end of the bow to hold the string, and a notch in each arrow shaft to fit the string snugly when drawn. Everything had to fit. Everything had to align. Because if it didn't, well, congratulations. You'd just spent 2 years building a boomerang that hated you. And yet, archers did this. Repeatedly. with reverence, sometimes, or at least grim dedication. Because the bow was not just a weapon, it was their profession, their protection, and in many cases, their retirement plan. And perhaps it was that, more than the craftsmanship, that made it beautiful. There was no pension scheme in medieval England for longbowmen, no golden handshake from the crown, no velvet-lined armchair by the fire in a quiet country estate, while your war stories faded gently into ale-scented legend. Instead, what awaited the seasoned archer was something between early-onset arthritis and a vague hope that someone remembered to bring bread. After years of drawing a weapon that required between 80 and 150 pounds of pull, depending on your luck, your diet, and whether or not you'd annoyed the quartermaster, your body had opinions. Specifically, your shoulder had started behaving like a wet bag of gravel, your fingers resembled root vegetables, and your back had decided that standing straight was a youthful folly for people with no experience of Agincourt. Your spine, once noble and upright, had slowly curved itself into what scholars today refer to as the archer's hunch. This was not an affliction so much as a lifestyle, one that came with benefits like being able to predict rain and scaring geese without trying. Many archers retired in the same way they'd lived, quietly, bent, and with a suspicious smell of wool and dried meat. If they were lucky, they might find modest employment as a watchman, or perhaps as the village cautionary tale. Children would ask, "Why does old Thomas shuffle like that?" And their mothers would say, "He loosed 500 arrows at Poitiers and hasn't sneezed without pulling a muscle since." Others took up work that didn't involve lifting anything heavier than a tankard. Pub doorman, garden scarecrow, unpaid village storyteller. The bow might have kept them alive, but it rarely made them rich. Some were granted small plots of land or a loaf of bread for service, though the quality of said loaf often ranged from chewy to medieval dental hazard. On particularly generous days, a retired archer might be given a pair of shoes, which was nice until you remembered that shoes, like bows, were rarely made in matching sizes and often stuffed with moss. But there was pride in those shoes, worn at a 30-degree tilt to accommodate the old war limp, and often the only footwear in the house not nailed to a wall to catch rats. There were no medals, no parades, just a well-worn bow hung above the hearth, or buried somewhere under a heap of potatoes, and the occasional nod from passing travellers who recognised the curve of your back as a symbol of old skill, not just old age. Meals were simpler, not by choice, but by dint of budget. A crust of rye, boiled cabbage if the gods were smiling, and something called meat that may once have seen an animal. This was the slow, culinary fade of a life lived fast, loud, and full of tensioned you. But retirement wasn't all gloom and hobbling. Some archers took on apprentices, not to fight, but to fix, to oil the bows, to tell exaggerated stories of shooting 10 arrows a minute uphill in the snow, while being chased by a particularly judgmental goose. And the stories, much like the men who told them, bent a little with time. But they held, because the longbowmen, even broken and bent, had done something few others had. They had helped win kingdoms. They had altered wars. They had stood behind staves of wood and string and turned the tide of history, one arrow at a time. And as they sat by the fire, rubbing beeswax into the same old bow they no longer drew, they knew they had earned their limp, their rye, and their place in the village pecking order, just beneath the reeve, but well above the man who cleaned chamber pots. If you think medieval archers spent all their time pulling bowstrings and squinting into the distance like heroic statues in muddy boots, you've forgotten an entire cottage industry built on tiny disagreements and goose-related feuds. Because for every bow loosed in battle, there was a small army of craftspeople behind the scenes, and not one of them could agree on anything. The arrows themselves were deceptively simple, a wooden shaft, an iron tip, and fletchings made from bird feathers. But this modest combination was the result of more squabbling than a Sunday tavern debate about saints, sin, or the precise number of toes a Frenchman had. Let's begin with the arrowsmiths. These were the unsung artisans, crouched by dim forges and soot-black anvils, hammering out bodkin points with all the joy of a man being paid in dried turnips. Their job was to shape metal tips sharp enough to pierce armor, but not so brittle they'd snap at the first clang of a helmet. Naturally, this led to a constant tug-of-war between the archers who wanted pointy and fast, and the smiths who preferred survivable and reusable. Then there were the shaft makers, usually woodworkers with strong forearms and a hatred for knots. Shafts had to be straight, light, and, most critically, consistent. And consistency was hard to achieve when your materials came from whichever forest hadn't been turned into firewood that week. Some preferred ash, others swore by birch or poplar. Occasionally, some heretic would experiment with hazel and find themselves exiled from the workshop until they'd recanted. But the real drama, the kind that caused decades-long rivalries and one legendary fistfight at a village fair, was all about feathers. Fletchers, the feather-attaching specialists, held very strong views on which bird produced the best flight. Goose feathers were the standard, but not just any goose. No. It had to be the right goose. A southern goose, if you believed in smoother flight. A northern goose, if you wanted something that could handle a stiff headwind. Swan feathers were a luxurious option, though likely to get you arrested for poaching royal birds. Crow feathers, too ominous. Chicken, utter madness. Even once the correct bird had been identified, fletchers would argue over which side of the wing to use, left or right, because arrows with all left or all right feathers would spin in flight, and no one could agree which spin was superior. Entire guilds split over this. Families fell out. Feathers were thrown, not just onto arrows, but across workshops in fits of passive-aggressive rage. Each fletcher had their signature pattern of binding thread, their own wax recipe for weatherproofing, and at least one deeply held belief that everyone else was doing it wrong. Apprentices were expected to memorize at least 3 different types of acceptable fletching techniques, and 5 reasons why the other types were an abomination. To make matters even more chaotic, fletchers had to deliver arrows by the thousands. Before battles, towns would be tasked with producing tens of thousands of them, stacking them in barrels and praying that at least half would fly in the general direction of the enemy. Arrows were expendable. Archers knew it. So did the fletchers. And yet still, each one was made with the hope that it might be the arrow, the one that sank cleanly into a gap in a breastplate, or bounced harmlessly off a helmet and gave the enemy a terrible headache. Even the glue used for attaching feathers was a topic of gossip. Too sticky, and it gummed up the flight. Not sticky enough, and the feathers fluttered off mid-air like startled butterflies, leading to a lot of awkward explanations when the shot veered into a pig instead of a knight. At the heart of all this chaos was a single, shared truth. Archery was a team effort. Not in the cheerful, morale-boosting sense, but in the everyone's stressed, underpaid, and elbow-deep in goose fluff sort of way. The archer might notch the arrow, but a whole village, or at least 3 violently opinionated tradesmen, had put it together. And when the shooting was done and the field quieted, those arrows littered the grass like the world's most passive-aggressive confetti. Bent, bloodied, broken, some lost forever, others gathered and repurposed. A few made their way back to workshops where fletchers muttered darkly about damage, carelessness, and how they told you the left-wing goose was superior. There is a quiet humiliation in learning to shoot a longbow, especially when the longbow is taller than you are. The string bites like a jealous cat, and your only target is a burlap sack nailed to a fence post that's seen better centuries. In medieval England, especially after the famous Assize of Arms and later the Statute of Winchester, the law didn't just encourage archery, it required it. Boys as young as 7 were expected to begin training with the bow, and by the time they could lift a sack of flour without groaning, they were meant to be hitting targets at 200 yards, or at least aiming in that general direction without striking their own foot. So began the time-honoured tradition of target practice in open fields, often mandatory on Sundays, after church, when one's soul had been lightly scoured clean and was thus primed for the equally holy act of missing a wooden post by 15 feet. The field was rarely ideal, perhaps a slightly uneven pasture, possibly the backside of a cow meadow, or whatever spot the reeve hadn't already commandeered for sheep counting. There would be wind, always. Not the theatrical gusts of battle, but the petty, fiddly breezes that toyed with feathers and self-esteem alike. And so, there they stood, archers in training, some serious, squinting into the horizon as if imagining a far-off enemy, others trying to remember which end of the bow pointed away from the chest. An occasional sheep would wander by, looking unimpressed. Pulling the string back was a lesson in anatomy. The longbow required significant strength, not just of arm, but of back, shoulder, and a mysterious muscle near the elbow that most people only discovered after 2 days of aching. The draw weight could exceed 100 pounds, and this wasn't something you eased into gently. You just did it, or you didn't, and you were quietly redirected to safer trades, like thatching or poultry maintenance. The arrow had to be placed just so, balanced against the knuckle, aligned to the eye, and released with a prayer to whichever saint was responsible for wrist control that week. Release it too early, and you'd lob the shaft like an angry twig. Too late, and you'd slap yourself in the jaw. There were entire folk songs written about archers who loosed poorly and struck a bee, or worse, a Reeves dog. Then there was the walk. After a round of shooting, someone, usually the least senior, had to go and collect the arrows. This involved trudging out into the field, dodging half-buried shafts, and enduring the smug looks of those who'd managed to hit the target. If you were lucky, your arrows were grouped in a loose constellation that could be justified. If not, you'd find one stuck in a thistle, one inexplicably bent, and one nestled inside a log like it was hiding from its responsibilities. Still, there was something soothing in the repetition, the twang of bowstrings, the gentle thud of impact, sometimes even on the target, the clatter of arrows being retrieved, inspected, and returned for another go. Young archers would begin to feel the rhythm, the sway of the body, the precise angle of elbow to sky. Some swore they could hear the wind talk after enough practice. Others simply muttered back, and the community came with it. On practice days, families would gather nearby. Mothers might bring bread crusts or leftover pottage. Younger siblings would watch, half in awe, half in boredom, until they could try themselves. The old men, retired bowmen from Agincourt, maybe, or just ones who claimed they were, would stand off to the side, nodding solemnly, offering unsolicited advice and coughing at regular intervals. Through this practice, a kind of unity formed, not from perfection, but from imperfection shared. Missed targets, snapped bowstrings, and the universal truth that everyone, eventually, would let go too soon and send an arrow limping sideways into a tree stump. And yet these awkward repetitions, done in sunlight and mist, under crows and distant tolling bells, shaped a generation of archers who, when the time came, would stand in muddy fields and loose volleys so thick they blotted out the Sioux. It always starts with waiting. Long, uncomfortable stretches of time where you are fully armoured in responsibility but completely without anything to do but exist. And think, mostly about mortality, sometimes about lunch, by the time the medieval archer was led toward a battlefield. He'd already spent years in practice fields, months in muster camps, and at least a few days rechecking his gear every 10 minutes like a nervous houseguest packing for a vacation that involved the strong possibility of being set on fire. Battle was never tidy. It was sprawling and cold and muddy, but we've promised not to overuse that word. So let's say the ground was soft, untrustworthy, and occasionally squidgy. The archer's role was to arrive early, remain calm, and fire thousands of sharp sticks at the general direction of the other side, without giving away just how little sleep he'd gotten. He would carry his bow, usually unstrung until the moment of truth, and a sheaf of arrows fletched with goose feathers. Some were broadheads for armourless enemies. Others, bodkins, were cruel little spikes meant to ruin a night's weekend. Either way, they weren't labelled nicely. You simply reached, knocked, and loosed in rhythm, while trying not to think about what each one might be interrupting on the other end. Formations were loose but purposeful. Archers were often deployed on the flanks, forming crescents or staggered lines designed to allow maximum chaos to fan outward like an ill-advised hairstyle. Stakes were driven into the ground in front of them, long, angled pieces of sharpened wood, not unlike particularly angry garden decor. These weren't aesthetic. They were meant to stop horses from galloping directly through you. That was always considered poor form. Orders came down from someone on a horse. Always someone on a horse. The mounted commander, wrapped in fine armor, would gesture, shout, and possibly wave a feathered hat. The archers, mostly kneeling in questionable soil, would squint, nod, and pretend they understood. Then came the signal, sometimes a trumpet, sometimes a banner, sometimes a loud and ambiguous shout that could have meant fire, or stop, or the king dropped his sandwich. And then, action. A wave of movement up and down the lines, bows raised, strings pulled back, like a collective breath being held. The sky would briefly fill with the sound of tension, wood creaking, strings straining, the flutter of feathers on the cusp of commitment. Release. A whoosh like a whisper multiplied by 1,000. A low, rushing sigh across the field as arrows lifted into the air, graceful, balletic, and entirely indifferent to the chaos they were about to cause. The aim was never individual. It was mathematical. You fired not at a face or a figure, but at a pattern, a section of the enemy lines, a square of sky that would soon lead downward into problems. The arrows landed in haphazard brilliance, some striking armor, some bouncing off helms, some embedding themselves in soft places that we don't name after dinner. Archers didn't reload slowly. There was no cinematic pause, no long breath between shots. Just reach, knock, draw, loose, again and again until your fingers blistered or the target list ran out. And you weren't alone. Behind you, more arrows would be handed forward. Beside you, fellow bowmen would curse the wind, grunt at a jammed arrowhead, or mutter prayers to saints not canonized for their military relevance. Smoke from distant fires would begin to drift across the field. Shouts would turn to screams. The clang of steel and the thud of hoofbeats began to blend into a sort of martial lullaby. One punctuated, occasionally, by someone behind you asking if anyone had seen the water skin. Time warped. The battle felt both endless and over in a blink. At some point, the shouting faded. The sky returned to silence. The commander on horseback would either be waving his hat in triumph or lying suspiciously still in a ditch. Either way, the archers would lower their bows and begin to count arrows, casualties, and blessings. Victory wasn't always clear. You might have pushed the enemy back, or just made them angry enough to return tomorrow with twice as many knights and half as much patience. But in that moment, standing amidst churned earth and spent shafts, you'd feel it. The ache in your shoulders, the burn in your fingers, and the weight of having survived. Once the battle had burned itself out, like an overcooked stew left on the hearth, the archers, much like everyone else not currently groaning on the ground or being hurried into medieval triage by someone with a bucket, found themselves in the quiet confusion known as aftermath. This was the part where the smoke drifted sideways instead of up, where the groans and shouts faded into muttered prayers and the occasional celebratory burp. The battlefield, which just hours earlier had been full of panic, motion, and airborne woodwork, now resembled a half-finished tapestry of human ambition, damp wool, and very inconveniently placed horses. Archers, having spent the better part of the day in a crouch or firing position, would now slowly uncoil like creaky drawbridges. There was groaning, not of pain, but of middle back discomfort, inner thigh tension, and the realization that you had once again forgotten to stretch before participating in full-scale warfare. The first order of business was usually inventory. Arrows were collected if they could be found and hadn't embedded themselves permanently in a tree, shield, or someone's cousin. The longbows, those prized, ewe-limbed companions, were unstrung with the care of someone putting a temperamental cat to bed. Quivers were shaken, emptied, and sometimes cursed at, usually for no reason other than stress release. Then came the gloves-off, helm-back part of the day, where everyone tried not to look too smug or too guilty. If your side had won, a term used loosely and often generously, then the time had come for the socially awkward ritual known as looting. Looting, in theory, was practical. One simply gathered what the fallen no longer needed: coins, gear, a surprisingly undented helmet, or perhaps an entire chicken someone had somehow kept on their person during battle. In practice, it was more like scavenging through a particularly grim yard sale. There were rules, unspoken and sometimes completely ignored. For example, don't loot your own side, don't argue over socks, and definitely don't try to carry a full suit of armor if you have the biceps of an underfed cheese merchant. More experienced archers didn't rush. They moved with the sort of slow, methodical elegance of someone who had done this before and knew exactly which pockets were most promising. They traded quiet quips sharp as arrowheads. Humor was currency now. A bit of gallows wit about someone's aim, someone else's trousers, or that one noble who looked dashing right up until he fell into a sheep trough. There were also moments of silence, of course. Private, blinking pauses where a bowman would stop to look around and wonder why, yet again, he had survived something so indiscriminate. It wasn't a deep philosophical moment, more of a tired, bone-level shrug from the soul. Then he'd get back to inspecting a fallen man's boots. By now, horses were being gathered. Those still in working order were calming down, or refusing to. Commanders were shouting in the distance. Shouting had been the consistent soundtrack of the day, and men were forming up again, no longer to fight, but to march, because battles didn't end. They just ran out of enthusiasm. Water was passed around in dented flasks. Bread, now mostly crumbs, made its reappearance. Someone tried to tell a bawdy story. Someone else told it better. The mood was strange, not cheerful, not solemn, just displaced, like everyone was waiting for someone to declare the official end of responsibility. As the sun dipped lower, turning the battlefield a syrupy gold, the archers began walking, away from the field, back toward the camp, or possibly just toward a patch of ground not saturated with consequences. There would be no hot bath, no cheering crowds, likely not even a thank you. Just aching feet, twitching forearms, and the vague relief of still being alive, however temporarily, and somewhere in the midst of all this quiet motion, someone would murmur the inevitable. Evening in a medieval archer's camp was not so much restful as it was slightly less loud. The battlefield, now behind them, was replaced with the kind of quiet that wasn't truly silence, more the soft clatter of iron buckles, the low mutter of sore men tending sore feet, and the occasional crackle of a fire that had been absolutely forbidden by the quartermaster but was happening anyway. The tents, if you could call them that, were rarely majestic. Some were made of heavy oiled canvas, frayed at the edges, patched with pieces of someone else's tent, and sagging like a noble's spine after his third wine goblet. Others weren't tents at all, just cloaks draped over sticks, creating a kind of sad fabric cave, part dwelling, part compromise. Here, archers sat in lopsided circles, their legs stretched out, boots off, toes wiggling like small, liberated prisoners. The smell was not ideal. Damp wool, sweat, and something mysterious involving old cheese. But no one had the energy to be offended anymore. They just breathed through their mouths and let it be. Dinner, such as it was, came in the form of rations. Salted meat if you were lucky. Bread if you weren't. Gruel if someone had overpromised and undercooked. Most of it was cold, and all of it had the texture of disappointment. Still, it was consumed with the weary gratitude of a man who knows tomorrow might serve even less. There was talk, of course, always talk. Not necessarily meaningful or even accurate, just the kind of talk that kept your brain from wandering into the darker corners. Stories of home, half remembered, half invented. Tales of legendary shots taken at impossible distances, all of which had somehow landed between a knight's armor plates and pierced a very specific spleen. Gossip about officers, imagined romances, jokes too crude for polite society and too specific for anyone outside the camp to understand. Some men tended to their gear, lovingly oiling bowstrings or sharpening knives they hoped not to use tomorrow. Others lay flat on their backs, eyes half closed, staring up at the fabric of their makeshift ceiling, lost in thoughts too complicated to unpack. Sleep came in layers, First came the nodding, then the slouching, then the brief burst of effort to find a softer patch of earth, which failed, and finally the slow collapse into what could only be described as functional unconsciousness. It wasn't restful exactly, it was survival in blanket form. Now and then, a patrol would pass through, heavy boots crunching on twigs, muttered orders, the occasional cough into a leather glove. Everyone pretended not to notice, unless the patrol came too close to the fire. Then someone would cough louder, subtly shield the flame, and mutter something about field warmth regulations with exactly the right amount of plausible confusion. For those who couldn't sleep, and there were always a few, there was the sky. An enormous, impossible sky, sprinkled with stars and questions that had no answers. They stared up at it, these men who had spent the day trying to take life, and found themselves humbled by the vast, impersonal ceiling of the universe. It didn't change anything, but it was there, and sometimes that was enough. And eventually, just before dawn teased its grey fingers across the canvas, the camp would fall into something approaching peace, which naturally was the perfect time to be woken up again for drill or dawn patrol, or whatever urgent thing the officer of the hour had decided would build discipline and readiness. It began, as most medieval misfortunes did, with the sound of a horn. Not a glorious, sweeping fanfare, not even a proper trumpet. Just a winded, slightly wheezy bleat that meant one thing: time to stop pretending you were asleep and start pretending you were awake. The training yard wasn't so much a yard as a patch of mostly level ground where the grass had long since been trampled into a mixture of churned dirt, crushed hopes, and the occasional chicken. There were targets, circles painted on old barrels, bundles of hay wrapped in cloth, and, in one questionable corner, a scarecrow with an unusually judgmental expression. Every archer in the camp dragged themselves out, bows in hand, bodies protesting. It was the kind of morning where your knees sounded like someone stepping on old kindling and your shoulders remembered every arrow you'd ever loosed in your short and injury-prone career. The longbow was not a forgiving weapon. 6 feet of yew and malice, it required more strength than elegance. Drawing one back repeatedly wasn't just a test of aim, it was an exercise in slow, methodical self-destruction. Shoulders wore out, fingers blistered, spines developed new, experimental curves, and yet, somehow, it was expected to be done before breakfast. The sergeant overseeing the proceedings had the air of a man who had long since lost the ability to feel joy. His armour creaked like disapproving furniture, and his voice, though never raised, carried the weight of unspoken threats. He didn't need to yell. His eyebrows did the heavy lifting. Archers lined up in ragged formation. No one truly stood straight. Some leaned, some swayed. A few blinked as if trying to remember which way was forward. They lifted their bows with the enthusiasm of wet cloth and notched arrows with the finesse of men still dreaming about being anywhere else. Then came the command, loose. A thunderclap of sighs followed. The bowstrings sang in a chorus of strained tension and painful familiarity. Arrows flew, some straight, many not. A few struck targets. One lodged itself into a barrel of something that may or may not have been ale. No one admitted to that shot, but everyone silently respected it. Training wasn't about perfection. It was about consistency, or more accurately, the consistent attempt to delay incompetence long enough to be marginally useful in the field. Between volleys, there were stretches of tired standing. Men shook out their arms, flexed their fingers, and tried not to think about how many arrows remained. Some mumbled complaints, others whispered advice they didn't quite believe. A few closed their eyes and just listened to the soft hum of wind, the twang of distant shots, and the occasional shout of "medic" from someone who had discovered that a taut bowstring and an untrimmed thumbnail made poor companions. By mid-morning, the sky was a soft white, like an old sheet hung too many times in the sun. Shadows shortened. The targets looked more like distant suggestions than actual goals, and every archer bore the subtle forward lean of a man who knew lunch was coming, but not fast enough. Blisters deepened, quivers emptied, motivation waned, and still the arrows flew. Eventually, when the sergeant had decided that discipline had been sufficiently inflicted, the group was dismissed with all the ceremony of a dropped spoon. No speeches, no praise. Just a short grunt and a wave that might have meant, "Go away," or "You're all doomed." Either way, it was accepted with quiet reverence. Archers shuffled off the field in small clumps. Shoulders rolled. Bows were slung lazily over backs. One man carried his arrows like a bouquet, muttering to them as if they had betrayed him personally. Another limped, though he hadn't come with a limp, and no one asked why. No medals, no applause. Just the knowledge that somewhere, sometime soon, they'd do it all again. And while many drifted toward the mess tent with the resigned grace of condemned poets, others, ever the gluttons for punishment, stayed behind to practice a little more. Perhaps they believed it would make a difference. Perhaps it gave them purpose. Or perhaps they just liked the feeling of hitting something that didn't hit back. If swords were symbols of nobility and lances were declarations of misplaced confidence, then arrows were something altogether humbler, anonymously lethal, absurdly numerous, and always vanishing just when you needed them most. An archer without arrows was like a monk without a candle, or a fish without complaints, technically functional, but missing the key accessory. And unlike the glamorous knight polishing his sword under a pavilion, or the noble lord with his tailored armor and backup horses, the medieval archer was, in many ways, a walking logistics problem. Arrows didn't grow on trees, not the sharp battlefield quality ones anyway. They grew in arguments, in long, tedious processes involving shafts of ash or birch, careful balancing, point forging, and the eternally underrated art of stealing feathers from geese without being pecked unconscious. The average archer's morning might begin with pulling a splinter from his hand and muttering something unkind about poultry. Each arrow had to be straightened, a task typically done by heating and eyeballing the shaft with a level of concentration one might reserve for threading a needle during a small earthquake. Then came the fletching, 3 feathers, evenly spaced, bound tight with sinew or glue that smelled suspiciously like boiled disappointment. Feathers, naturally, were in short supply, and so emerged the entirely unofficial yet widely practiced sport of feather pilfering. One man's arrow bin was another man's resource depot. It was considered poor form to outright steal, of course, but repurposing someone's abandoned shaft or casually borrowing from communal stores was a long-standing tradition. Some archers even named their arrows, not out of sentiment, but so they could publicly shame anyone caught shooting them. The arrowhead was another matter. Forged by blacksmiths who were paid in meat, beer, or questionable promises, these small metal tips came in all shapes. Barbed, bodkin, broadhead, or whatever this was supposed to be. You could, with luck, retrieve an arrow after battle, but whether it was yours was another question. Field collection was often an undignified scramble through churned earth, charred grass, and the occasional boot. Many arrows died young, snapped beneath hooves, broken against shields, or simply disappearing into hedgerows to confuse future archaeologists. Maintaining a full quiver was a personal crusade. Some archers crafted their own, others begged, borrowed, or reluctantly commissioned them. A few industrious types even ran side hustles, making arrows in the evening for those less skilled or more easily shamed. Payment was rarely in coin. More often it was in extra rations, ale, or the unspoken agreement not to tell anyone about that time you shot a tree instead of a charging horseman. The weight of a full quiver was both comfort and curse. It reassured, yes, but it also reminded you that you were, in all likelihood, expected to use every single one. And while a knight might get away with swinging dramatically and missing, an archer's mistake stuck in the mud for everyone to see. Or, worse, in the back of something they weren't supposed to hit. There were rules. There were also cover stories. Some archers painted their arrows for quick identification, red tips for range, blue shafts for barbs, green fletchings if you were trying to be sneaky in a forest, which worked right up until you realized forests are filled with things that eat green. Others developed deeply personal rituals, always placing the heaviest arrows on the left, muttering small curses while stringing the bow, or tapping each arrowhead twice against their boot before use, not for luck, but to scare off splinters. Of course, none of this helped much when the rain came. Wet feathers drooped, shafts warped, bowstrings stretched, and suddenly your precise killing instrument was firing in gentle arcs that seemed more interested in birds than enemy soldiers. Whole skirmishes were lost to humidity. The smart archers learned to carry wax. The smarter ones learned to lie. In the end, the archer's life was a quiet series of minor battles, against poor craftsmanship, poor weather, and poorer pay. A full quiver was never just a supply, it was a statement. I have prepared, I have fletched, I have not yet stolen from my neighbour today.